Yeah, well, there's a lot more kind of, in a sense, behind the scenes of all of this, but one thing that's kind of hard to overemphasize is the importance of the early things that Norway got right, upon which then everything they have developed has sat well. So because they did that big thing in 1814, where they published this constitution, it just did a very ordinary thing. It gave the vote to male adult landowners, and actually that's in almost every constitution around the world. It's the same phrase, it's the same clause. But because so many Norwegians owned land, it had a hugely dramatic effect, so that 45% of that group became voters overnight in 1814. You take the same clause that, male landowners of the age of 25, that was in our Reform Act of 1832 in Britain, and it enfranchised 5% of those men. And in Scotland, a shocking 2.8%. And that tells you why land has always been important, because originally in societies, it was what got you able to vote. So for 200 years, the Norwegians have had this, actually practically the world's widest electorate, second really only to the French, who had to achieve that by slightly more revolutionary and upsetting means. So the Norwegians really had the most democratic and peacefully arrived at franchise in the world for 200 years. So they had what was called a peasants' parliament, a sort of dismissive term that I think came largely from Britain. And the proof of it is, you remember that shot when we were down in the basement looking at the Constitution, and there was a lot of red seals on it, if you remember. A lot of those were actually the fingerprints of the men who wrote the Constitutions, because they couldn't write. Now that's your real deal. That is real peasants, right? This is not middle class people and professionals coming in and speaking for the little people. This is the little people. They got in. They got to write the Constitution. And actually, little people, peasants, are pretty clever people when they have the courage of numbers and the job to do. So what did they do? Well, in 1837, the peasants abolished nobility. I think we could just have a little round of applause there. And kind of like, how brilliant was that? They just sort of said, well, all right, if you think you're noble, you can be noble, for the rest of your life. But we're not having any hangers-on getting that one, That ends with you, honey. And actually, what a fabulous precedent. Do you know, there are 37 dukes in Britain, and they all own land in Scotland. So there's the peasants, clever thing number one. Clever thing number two was that they passed a sort of Municipalities Act. And that sounds a bit boring, but what it meant is that they decided they weren't going to be run by Oslo. So basically the state, the Norwegian state, wasn't going to be some kind of monolithic thing that was, run hundreds, thousands of miles away. Norway was going to be a place that was going to be run right here, right now. It was always going to be little tiny powerful councils. So Norway and Scotland have the same number of people. They have 422 councils. We have 32. Now this is a biggie, because this is the next big building block of why Norway works. Because what that means, this is, people perhaps don't appreciate that Scotland has the largest so-called local authorities in the developed world. Our average kind of so-called local council is 170,000 people, which, most people have not much of a reaction to that, because back end's what's normal anywhere. The EU average size of council is 10,000 people. The average in Germany, just to take a country that's no slouch in economic or social terms, Germany 7,000 people, and the average size, physical size of a council in Germany, suddenly forgotten actually, is 15 square kilometres, The average physical size of a council in Scotland, 990 square kilometres. As a result, in Norway, because it's so local, and there's a sort of rule of thumb that you shouldn't be more than half a mile from the council HQ, Highland region. And because of that, you can have council meetings in the evening because most people can get home easily, and it means you don't therefore have to pay councillors. It's a pretty onerous job, but it can be done out with their working hours. And because there's such a civic society, anyone who's employed gets time off to be a councillor, the same way that people get time off to be trade union officials. Just by the by, in these little councils, you don't have, you know, a kind of separate director of education, housing, whatever, on 120,000 quid. You have two people who are maybe the director of housing, education, planning and roads, that's one of them, and you know, you can have many hats in small councils, and they're not paid as much. So you've got a template for a very different type of democracy, and the result of it is that in Norway, 1 in 88 people stands for election. In Scotland, 1 in 2,071 stands for election. This to me is just like beyond crazy, but clearly because our sort of, you know, the formal democracy doesn't work, and this is, by the way, not getting at councillors, it's not people. I mean, people are trying to hold a pretty crap system together, actually. This is looking at structures, not people. But here we are with this really unfit for purpose, I think, kind of system, which flares us off. Our energy can't be harnessed in that. But obviously, community action is what harnesses us, and that actually, to my mind, kind of sets a template for what Scotland does all the time. We don't tackle rubbish structures, we just create parallel ones, we double dumped. So what you do is you pay your taxes for councils that are so large that you don't really know anybody on them, and then you spend half your life volunteering your own time in the community to fix the things that don't really kind of quite fit properly. You could look at our taxation the same way. Some of you heard this a bit earlier, but the Norwegians, as we've heard there, have high taxes. You know, it's 40% personal tax. But for that, you don't ever have to pay twice for some private protection because you're worried that the council services are so rubbish. So here, you might, if you've got elderly relatives, your mum or dad perhaps, you might take a look at the council-run old folks' home and you think, I'm not putting them there. So you pay twice.
They're private.
So you pay twice. So you pay in your taxes for facilities that you don't end up using. And obviously, some people do the same with health, and some people do the same with education. In Norway, it's illegal to make a profit out of education. So everybody's kids, it's the ideal that Scotland always had with comprehensive education, but it's real. So that there's the smallest wealth gaps in the world in Norway and Sweden. So already, talking about class, everybody finds very uncomfortable in Norway because they don't really see that way. But, you know, the professionals and working people, all of them are being educated together, and you get incredibly high standard services. So what do you want to do? Do you want to pay once for services that don't maybe quite fit the bill and aren't actually here? Yesterday, wherever it was somebody from the Highlands pointing out that there was one nursery in the whole of Sutherland. So that's what you get for paying your taxes. You then have to fork out separately to get what works for you. So, you know, why not stop this double dunting and just pay more money for services that the state, the councils will provide that are high quality and keep everyone on board? And the reason that doesn't quite seem to kind of catch the imagination here is because you don't trust that will happen. The Nordic countries have the highest recorded levels of trust in the world between citizens and between citizens and governments. And of course it's a virtuous circle, because the more you get delivered brilliant services, the more you believe that your tax money is worth paying. So actually all the Nordics have had conservative governments at some point over the last 10 years who haven't really changed this system dramatically at all. So in fact, the tram system that you saw in Oslo, did you get an accent there? That tram system was basically put in over 20, 30 years by a conservative council in Norway. And the same thing is true in Helsinki, in Finland. It's conservative councils who've put all the trams in. And their outlook is that they believe in investing in the public realm to safeguard private investments. I mean, you'd wish you had kind of that Tories here, you know. So this is just a different take, really, on what might be possible. But what would have to happen is that you would have to move to having a government you trust. And whether that's Scottish or British, that's necessary, or no one will ever shell out more money to get the services that would mean you stop having to do everything twice. And getting it right first time is a bit of a slogan for the Scottish Government. It's what we should be aiming for, because it's the only thing that makes people really believe in society. When you use services that are rubbish, a little bit of your wee heart breaks. You know, you don't believe in it now. This is why all the problems with ScotRail, all the problems with Murray Council, you know, all these kinds of things are so destructive to people's belief that you can actually run societies pretty well, and you can. But you need to be a bit grown, you know, you need to take some big decisions, really, about whether you want to just keep stumbling along with structures that are not really helping us be who we can be. Right, that's a big long old spiel, but it gives you time to think of a few questions, I would have thought. So fire away. And I'm just going to say that women have to ask questions as well, or I just sit down. I'm serious about that. Okay, gals?
Something really struck a chord with the Scots couple that are living in Norway, and both, you know, art, yeah.
Tassie and Scott,
yeah. Art people, about the creative industries and innovation. Obviously I'm English, I've lived here for about 12 years now, and I feel that there's so much creativity and interesting stuff going on. What worries me is that down south, and hopefully Scotland doesn't go this way at all, universities are starting to only accept sciences, maths, English, history. All the arts have been pushed down or completely, you know, off availability because the schools have run it down. The schools are taking the arts and the you know, they're concentrating on the academic subjects. And it really scares me that that's the way a country is going, that you're only any use if you can make money. You're only any use to your society if you can make a profit.
Well, there's one way you could characterise the difference between British society and Nordic society, and it is that in the Nordics, the market is part of society, and in Britain, society is part of the market. Now that's just very wrong. Not just because eventually it just stifles all innovation and all oofiness, you know, the stuff that just gets you up in the morning, and love and joy and all sorts of things that kind of matter to keep you healthy. But it's not popular. And actually, I think that I would say actually that difference, I think, exists between Scotland and England. There's so many ways you can see that we have just gone, oh no, with lots of stuff. Whether that's we don't have 3-star hospitals. I mean, what kind of concept is that actually? And we're trying to keep an emphasis on culture, but we're nowhere near as strong as the Nordics. And it's because we've caught a bit of the virus. I mean, being in Britain in a post-Thatcher era has sort of, you're right, it has turned everything into a materialist world, which is why we started the film with Tuta sitting in her blooming heaven in Lanoya, who wouldn't give you her hut for 10 million kroner. And she's a working class woman. You can tell because her English isn't that good and she didn't brush her hair before the interview. Right? She's lovely. They're just totally down to earth, totally cheery people. And they know what matters. What matters is exactly what she said. It's having somewhere that you can go, relax, enjoy nature, have a great time with your family and your friends, and have a good life. You know, and that's not money, as she put it, you know, right? Well, I mean, actually everyone here would sort of aspire to that, and then go, well, you know, it's a bit like, that sounds like a babyish thing. That's like a wee childish hope, and it's not. That's what could keep a nation alive. If any of you watched the Iceland of Pharaohs film, there's a point at the end of the Pharaohs one, I think, when one of the guys, Ollie, says of the Scots, he said, you know, he's listing all the advantages that Scotland has, and his culminating point is, you're a friendly nation. And I've watched audiences seeing that who sort of go, is that it? Friendly? You know, I mean, that hardly cuts it, does it, in a cutthroat competitive world? Friendly? You know, friendly does work. Friendly is why the European Union has backed Ireland. Friendly is why the Irish passport is the most valuable passport in the world, along with the Swiss and the Icelanders. Friendly works. Friendly is a form of currency. Friendly gives you pride. Friendly is the basis of why you're here. I'd buy Friendly.
Yes, would you?
You know? So the thing is that let's don't wobble off all of this. You've got to consciously repel the Snow Queen. Yep.
Hi. I was wondering if you could give me a comeback to people like, if I'm arguing about people extolling the virtues of the Conservatives and Thatcherism and whatnot, and people see something like a rising, which is a phrase I can't stand because I didn't think it's true, a rising tide lifts all boats. You know, what's my comeback to that?
Right. Well, here's my kind of observation of this, because if you were to look, I mean, I wrote the book Blossom there, which tries to look at a lot of the reasons that Scotland is kind of stuck. And one of it, I was looking at a sociologist who called Geert Hofstede, he's Dutch, and he made a sort of typology of all countries so he could compare them. And he created masculine and feminine countries. Now, the masculine, the feminine countries are not just all run by women, they have characteristics. And unfortunately, all the nasty characteristics are masculine. Sorry, guys. But masculine countries are top-down, competitive, devil type to take the hindmost. They're quite exciting and they're always in the news. I don't know if you can think of someone like that, right? And feminine countries are cooperative, consensual. They may be less exciting and they tend not to be in the news. And the world's most feminine country is Sweden. Then all the Nordics are listed, and in that table, Britain comes in at 53. It's pretty masculine, pretty competitive, pretty top-down, and all the rest of it. If you then take the UNICEF Child Wellbeing rankings and put them right beside those countries, they follow exactly the same way. The feminine countries are the ones where children just are better, you know, are healthier, have a better outlook, and so on. And then if you stick in the GDP ratings from the OECD, you find there's no particular pattern. It's pretty variable, actually. You know, the mean as hell countries are not richer than the cooperative ones. And the question would be sort of, I mean, how you could sort of just show that in a quick way is the feminine countries are worried about where the average is, the masculine countries are worried about where the elite is. They believe that if you just keep putting power to the elite, then they'll be trickled down and they'll all be inspired by them, you know, which is just such arrant nonsense. I mean, it's been disproved economically that these figures are particularly strong on in that one. The feminine countries think that the average is what you have to shift, because that's the one where if you shift the average, all boats will tend to rise on that one. I would have thought boats tend to rise much more healthily, actually, if they've got a rock of the average improving above them. So here's an example of it. I mean, is Scotland a sporting nation? If you looked at it in the kind of masculine way, you'd say, of course we were. Look at all the medals we won at the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics and all that kind of thing. But the feminine way of looking at it would be to say, half of us can't run for the bus. Right, these things are true at the same time. Which one matters more?
Yeah.
Yes, buy the book. Yeah.
In 2014, I feel we failed to convince people on an economic level. We also failed to convince, in the main, women to vote yes. And I personally feel that those two things were linked. I feel that if a woman on her own, or in fairly strapped circumstances, was trying to manage budgets, then she's far more unlikely to want to take the kind of risk that we were asking women to take. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, any ideas, anything that you think might contribute to a change, or what campaigners could do at campaigning level in order to redress that.
I mean, I've got to say, I live in awe of everybody who goes out and talks to the public, including, believers in top-down stuff and conservatives. I mean, as the wee man said in a different situation, I salute your indefatigability in a big way, because that's not something I do. So, I mean, what strikes me about all of it is that all of Scotland is risk averse. It's not just women, and women pick up a vibe. We're very good at picking up vibes. We pick up defaults. We pick up what's not expressed. We pick up unease. We pick up all sorts of stuff like that. I mean, guys do too, but women are pretty blooming good at it, because we have been brought up to often look at situations through the interests of other people. So if you're feeling a general lack of comfort or an unease or a sort of hesitancy about something, the women are the canary down the coal mine. They're the ones that are going to pick it up first. So the whole question for Scotland really is, I ken that folk will probably prefer in life to just think, this is all kind of complicated, and I just want a quiet life, I don't want this level of complexity and endless bloody elections and referendums, and it will be risky. There's no point in saying to people there isn't risk involved in becoming an independent country. There is. The big thing is there's risk in every blinking option that sits in front of us at the moment. And it's almost like we have been infantilized into thinking that there is strong and stable government sitting somewhere. And I know it's sort of easy to laugh, but the kind of way that a kind of patriarchal, almost like the kind of way that Britain has operated, is with extraordinarily double standards. So that Theresa May can stand and say strong and stable. We can all laugh ourselves hoarse about her, but she still has a little something sitting there where people just believe that voice, that backdrop, that tradition, that hundreds of years, that reference to the Westminster as the mother of parliaments. What? So the mother of parliaments that uses an archaic voting system that perpetuates us and them, keeps confrontation as the only model in society, inflicts that and infects industrial workplace democracy with the same grinding tensions. The rest of the world moved on. 200 years ago, the Norwegians put proper proportional representation into their system, so they just moved seamlessly into a situation where they're used to cooperating. And yet we still tolerate descriptions of Westminster as the mother of parliaments. I mean, that is some evil bloomin' mother, if that's the way you look at it. And the feelings of specialness. We haven't got enough understanding of what our neighbours have been up to realise what arrant nonsense that is. Do we think the Belgians don't have a health service? Do we think that all the Nordics didn't also have incredibly efficient health service? We're not special in any of this now. All of this is run better by countries that put their own people first, that do not have hierarchies and elites to the same degree, and that have exploded all these archaic ways of making people look important a long time ago. Pardon me. So I know that, you see, the trouble is, that's a long, God, the person on the doorstep's died already, you know, so that's what I mean. Obviously, I'd be a total losser at that. But, I mean, that's why I don't do that, because it's a very tough job. I don't know how much someone will be persuaded in one moment. All I can imagine is that it places a seed. I have a great confidence in people. And I've seen what happens, that, you know, when someone has a little seed of thought, something that connects with something they're interested in, it turns. You've got to believe it turns. You know, someone will take that away and think about it. The job then needs to be picked up by the next contact or thought. And at the moment, the trouble is that that's not really happening, because the media is not encouraging an opening up of thought. It just sits and does Punch and Judy, because it's learnt it from somewhere. The mother of Parliament. So it's unfortunately, it's a self-fulfilling, you know, not very good way of running things at the moment.
I think one of the things for me that came across all those countries, they've done a lot.
But we're not, lad.
All the countries that we've seen have done a lot of inward investment, and that's what seems to be very much lacking. I know that's a British national problem as well as Scotland, but I'm always focused on renewables, and I'm just conscious that all the wind turbines and things that we put up in the whole of Britain just come from Germany and Sweden and Norway. And you know, it's not rocket science to build turbines and things. You know, the industry, the oil industry, could switch over to these things, but there hasn't seemed to have been investment or the interest to do that.
There was at the beginning. There was Gordon Proven was a big, a big manufacturer of the very first small turbines. But yes, and I mean the tragedy is that what you saw there, that Dave Pearson is doing with Star Renewables in Govan. I mean, you know, the Norwegians are kind of happy to think that that's world-beating technology. He's not got a gig in Scotland. And I was speaking kind of all over the place, but in Inverclyde and in Clydebank. And in Inverclyde, right, so Greenock, Port Glasgow, whatever, they'd actually taken Ronnie, the Cowan, the MP, had taken Dave there to talk to Inverclyde Council, because they're similar high. They've got water everywhere, you know, and they've got shipyards, they've got all the kind of places they could do, they've got a new building, and that's the good moment to put district heating in. And they just laughed at him. It is actually Clydebank the next day. There is a huge new bit of new build going in, and there is district heating, and they've got Dave Pearson's kit there. So actually, at long last, he's getting a gig. But what he needs to make a step change is for the easy options to be progressively shut down. And this is true everywhere. You've got to close down easy options. And you know, Scotland is a part of Britain, and British politicians lie. They don't give the hard options to people. They just keep never-nevering us. So, for example, the Danes, you know, some of us are old enough to remember the 1970s oil crisis. You remember, you know, those of us who can't walk out of rooms without shutting lights off and closing doors. The Danes had that with knobs on because they then discovered they had no indigenous energy supplies. And that made them realise suddenly how very precarious their situation was. So they never brought the oil price down again from 1973. The high that it was at then is still what it is today. And the cost of cars, they bumped it right up because they wanted to take their population away from a dependency on fossil fuels of which they had none. That's why they then brought in turbines, even though the take that they get from wind is crap compared to us. They get about 17% sometimes from the wind. The Orkneys has got 55%. So they made that political decision not to be dependent on things that they didn't have and to shift their economy completely into new things. And again, despite the fact they've had conservative governments, they've never gone back. Now that's what I call politics. That's what I would like us to think about trying to persuade people to do. But again, you need cohesion, honesty, and trust, and a far-sighted electorate that hasn't been sugar bought into solutions that are not the illusion of control, you know. And the trouble is that people, I think, in Britain tend to think that really, they would just really rather have money in their hip pocket than contributing to any sort of collective solution to anything. And so there's the difficulty in it all. I mean, you need to have big, bold decisions, and Dave needs us to decide a date after which you cannot have gas in buildings, in new buildings. And that'll make everyone go, oh my God, because it's cheaper. Of course it's cheaper. It's always cheaper until you get volume. Well, how long are we going to wait till we can get volume on these things? I merely ask.
Sorry, Lesley, just in my horrible role of party pooper, 2 more questions?
Yep, well, you've got one, didn't you?
Well, just on the suite of films you've done, A Small Family of Small Nations, do you think there's any hope of Norway Plus as a Brexit option?
I don't really, because, well, you saw Oivin's explanation there. The Norwegians were never in the EU, so they're, they have not experienced the full benefits, if you like. So at the moment, they can avoid, as he said, all the political kind of control. They're not in the common fisheries policy, and they've got a huge fishing industry. We don't. That's also why Iceland isn't in Europe. It's in the halfway house too. Anyone that's got a big fishing industry as proportion of their income does not want to be in the EU with the CFP. So that's different, from Britain and there. There's some other biggies though. You have to accept freedom of movement. There's just no way around it. To be able to be part of the single market. And it baffles me as to how anyone thinks either political party in England is going to sell. I mean, it's like Jack and the Beanstalk, when he comes back trying to persuade his mother that selling the coup was a good idea because he got 3 wee shriveled up beans, right? So you come back after all this turmoil and everything and say, hey, we've got this great deal. We pay about 90% of the dues that we've ever paid before. We have no control whatsoever on the regulations that come out, but we have to observe 100% of them. We are still run by the European Court of Justice, so hey, that rule taking? We're really rule taking central now. And here we are, folks, the icing on the cake here. Freedom of movement, yeah! You buy it? Can you see that working with an English electorate that has been whipped up into displacing all its kind of fairly justifiable annoyance with the so-called Mother of Parliament onto Europe for reasons I find baffling? Are they going to really buy that? And there's one tiny, tiny little final problem. The Norwegians don't want the UK in their club. I know that's only a small thing, right? But EFTA has got 4 members, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Switzerland. You'll spot they're all quite small. They've got bespoke agreements that have taken them 20 to 30 years to achieve, trade agreements around the world, which are mostly fitting, the kind of societies they are, the Alps and the Nordics. Here's this great gate-crashing blooming Leviathan of the UK. Remember what we said before, the kind of place that places the market above society in value terms doesn't fit Norway and Iceland at all, or Switzerland. I don't know too much about Liechtenstein, I would guess the same. So they want, the UK sticking its big arse into the middle of their wee nest like a blooming hole in the head. So I can't see this being in Norway's interests. And no matter how much they have a Conservative Prime Minister who is trying to kind of do a bit of common cause with, I was going to say Margaret Thatcher, but that's not a good reason. Theresa May, right? But I can't see in the end, they're very rational people, and in the end their politics usually comes down to one thing: what is in the real interest of this country? And I can't see anyone thinking it's in Norway's interest to have the UK in EFTA. Last question? Yep.
Yeah, I just would love to hear your perspectives on nation identity. Because one of the things that's really impacted me watching both the Iceland and this Norway is how the Norwegians and the Icelanders really seem to you use the word self-determination with the Norwegians, you use the term with the Icelanders, real risk takers, because they believe in themselves and they believe in their worth and value and all that they have and their culture and all the rest of it. I'm just interested, as you did your research, was their primary identity being Nordic nations, or was their primary identity with being Norwegian, Icelandic and Faroe Islands? And the reason behind my question is, I'm a newcomer, I'm an incomer, as you can hear from my accent, and I've been really surprised since moving up here how many people in Scotland seem to still see their primary identity as British rather than Scottish, and that has been such a shock to me. It's an observation, I've only been here 2 years, but it's really shocked me because for me, Scotland as a nation is a nationality to be celebrated.
Well, yes, because Britain is not a nation, it's a state. It's not, I mean, in a sense, a nation is Benedict Anderson described it as an imagined community. You'll never meet all the members of it, but in your imagination, you're held by it. And people are not tending to be held by a state. It's a much more perfunctory thing that has an army, so that I mean, many people have said that kind of a language is a dialect with an army. So you get to a kind of a formal level of acceptance of a state. You probably never get a warm and fuzzy about it, to be honest. That warm and fuzzy really is tending to apply to national identity. We all meet different people. I meet very few, actually, and the statistics suggest very few people in Scotland identify as British first and Scottish second. It's about 70% are Scottish first, British second. So, you know, that's the kind of average, but obviously, you know, in different places you get different pockets of whatever. But no, all these Nordic nations identify absolutely as themselves first. Because if you look at the Faroes and Iceland, I mean, I would say, I would give my eye teeth to be trying to get shot at Denmark, not England, or not Britain. Because they're a much more benign set of people. In fact, to be honest, if we were part of Denmark, we probably wouldn't be trying to get shot at anybody. I mean, the energy to do it would be hugely depleted by their damned reasonableness. You know, when the Faroese voted so nearly to become independent, the Danes realised they had to persuade them to stay on board and gave them the world's most powerful parliament, including the right to make international treaties on their own, which resulted in their decision in 1973 to remain outside the EU, whilst Denmark joined even, and nobody died. You know, so these guys are very, very clear that they are who they are, but they are tremendously cooperative at the same time. And actually, once you get yourself out of a British mindset, there's just no, there's no contradiction in this. So, for example, Norway, as we know, is not in the EU, but it joined Schengen to make life easier for its neighbours. Can you believe that? I mean, we're in the EU and we were never joining Schengen because we're just too darn special. We need to get all our guys going to the leper colonies at the end of every airport, you know, 400 miles from all the normal gates, so that, you know, we have a separate way of entering and exiting Europe. Whereas the Norwegians just went, it's just easier, isn't it? So they joined, and the reason for that is that they had formed a Nordic travel area 40 years before Schengen was thought of. So you don't need these, you know, these guys, I would say it's the opposite. These guys are so confident about their own national identity, they can be generous. When you're not confident, you're not generous. You're kind of nippy. And the way that the Nordic sort of area works so well together is because all these kind of feelings of nippiness have gone because people have got what they wanted, which was they've got their national identity. Strangely, they come back very often to being hardly very different from their neighbours. But they can easily make common cause. I think that probably is where you'd like to think the British Isles would get to, but James, I don't know if any of us will live to see kind of quite that amount of, you know, daylight.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Lesley. That's terrific. Pushed you back, as the saying goes. But just to say to the rest of you, if you think we could run this again, and you could all bring one or two skeptics with you about the US goes, that might be the way to get this message into a broader audience. But thanks again, Lesley, and stay tuned.